So I want to start with some font fine-tuning in my tabs here, in the header, and also the text here on my recipes. I want to make sure that everywhere I'm using the right font, my own custom fonts. And especially here in the header and the tabs, we're not really ensuring this yet. Of course, it's relatively easy to ensure that though, and let's start with the header. The header is generally styled, like the background color, with our default navigation options, which we always set up on the Stack Navigator, right? The default navigation options here allow us to, well, style the header, and for example, give the header in general a style and add a background color. Now, important to recognize here is that header style really only targets the box, the background, so to say. So the container in which the action items, the back button, and this title sits. The title itself can't be targeted with header style. But of course, we get an alternative to that. Besides header style, where we can style that header container, we also got a header title style, and that unsurprisingly targets the text component in which our header title is presented. And there we can style it like we can style text elements in React Native. For example, by adding a font family of Open Sans. Again, I'm using the non-bold version so that we can quickly see the difference. This clearly is not bold anymore, I guess. It's pretty clear to see, especially here on iOS. And now if I set this to bold, I ensure that I use this right style on both iOS and Android. Now for the back text here, by the way, we can also override that default, which is the default system font, by setting the header back title style. That's a separate setting we can set up here, and there we can also set the font family to, let's say, Open Sans. Not the bold version. I don't want to have that in a bold style, but I want to have it in my own font. And this should now be Open Sans here and use my own font. On Android, of course, this does not have an effect because there we have no back text. So that's one thing. That's the header. For the tabs, it's pretty similar. There we can go to our tab navigator we're creating, like the Material Bottom tab navigator. And this, of course, has our tab screen config and then this second object where we configure the navigator itself. And as always in React Navigation, it's the second object where we can control the general look and feel of the navigator-specific things, like in the case of the tab navigator, the tab icon color, the bar color, the tint color, or also the label style. And indeed here on the tab bar options for the bottom tab navigator, we can add a label style. And again, this targets the text component which holds our label. We can add a font family here of Open Sans bold so that we can clearly see the difference. If this reloads, now this clearly is some bold text. And actually this doesn't look too bad, so I think we can keep this. But of course you could also set it to just Open Sans if you want the thinner version. But now it uses our own font. Now for Android here, the Material Bottom tab navigator also has some configuration options, but actually it doesn't have a label style. What you can do there instead is on the separate tabs you're loading, so in the navigation options of the tabs you're loading, where you're also setting the tab bar icon and so on, there we can add tab bar label here, where we could set a label like meals, multiple exclamation marks to override what we use as a label, now both on iOS and also on Android. And that can actually be a string like this, but you can also set this to a React component, to a text component, namely. And then in there, you can set up your label, meals. But of course, now here you can add style and add any styles you want. So a little bit of a workaround since there is no other built-in way of styling this for the Material Bottom tabs navigator, but better than nothing. So here we can now set font family to Open Sans bold. And if we do that, we of course also have to make sure we now import the text component from React Native, because otherwise we can't use it down there. And now with that, we also get this on iOS, of course, because we're sharing the config. We'll fix this in a second. But now this is how we can set up our own style there as well. But of course, we now lost the color, which is a downside of setting this manually here. And since we only need this workaround here for Android for the Material Bottom tabs, the easiest fix is to use the Platform API and only set this tab bar label to this text component if we're on Android, because only then we need this workaround to set the font family. So I'll check if we're on Android, and if that's the case, I'll return a text component here. Otherwise, I'll just return the text meals. And then the advantage of just returning a text here simply is that our other settings, which set the tint color and the label style and so on, will kick in and will not be overwritten. If we set our own text component, we'll disable all that default feature, all these default features which are built into the bottom tab navigator. The problem with the material bottom tab navigator is that it simply doesn't have all these default features built in. So there we need to override this, but we only need to do this for Android on the other hand. And now we can copy that and do the exact same thing, of course, here for favorites. Render favorites as a text on iOS, and of course also in the text component for Android. And with that, we now should have a style that works. And this looks good on iOS. There, we basically didn't change anything. And on Android, there, we now also have our own custom fonts. So that's a little bit of a workaround, which is required here, unfortunately, when working with the bottom tabs navigator, but also not too hard to implement. And with that, we're making sure that we're using our own custom font everywhere in the navigation-related features of our app.